While the Strohbachs contemplated their immigration to Australia, I was advised by government officials that if I wanted to have nothing to do with Turkey, I should consider doing the same, as there was no guarantee that I could stay in Germany permanently. However, there were several other options, and the Strohbachs were keen to try them, one of which was to adopt me as their son. They explained that it would please them immensely if they could later pass their wealth on to me. They were going to try what had not been successfully tried before, but which was worth considering. They applied for political asylum on my behalf, and after several interviews, it looked promising. A long while passed, and I heard nothing in regard to that application, assuming it was successful. In the meantime, the Strohbachs had applied for migration to Australia in earnest, and were subjected to several health checks and interviews. When they received the final invitation, their application being successful for an assisted passage to the land down under, they were extremely surprised about Australia's whites-only policy. When they left, I had to find different accommodation, and there was a place in a nearby suburb where I could stay as long as I wanted. The house I was going to move into was owned by a wonderfully pleasant Sister Nurk, the widow of a war veteran. She did not go to a church or kingdom hall for age-related health reasons, but was happy to accommodate me and have someone to share her thoughts and memories with. She treated me as if I was her son. She gladly washed my clothing, changed my bedding, and sometimes cooked food, which included herb and vegetable soups, although it was not my preference, but I appreciated her efforts. Her house belonged to the old world, and was reasonably sized. In front of her lounge room, outside the large window, there was a brick-walled attachment, an architectural oddity originating from the olden days when it belonged to a farm, and although now empty, it most definitely stank like pig droppings. Obviously, it was once used by the farmers for compost, for even after all those years, one could still smell it. Sister Nurk claimed it smelled like Limburger cheese. Strangely, it did not bother me. Often I found her silently reading the Bible, and she loved talking about the good Lord. I paid her a small amount of rent for the room I occupied, and also gave her extra cash towards food and energy bills. She was very happy. The authorities assured me that if I decided to marry a German citizen, my circumstances would also change accordingly. My stay would become permanent, and after some time I could apply for German citizenship. However, much later I was informed by the same authority that due to unexpected discrepancies with the Turkish government, they could stop my education and force me to go back to Turkey. What a change of heart! Apparently my father was demanding some authorities to help his son to be forced to return to Turkey and complete the conscripted military service. I was not certain about that, and feeling extremely devastated by this new development, I wondered why he, who never wanted me to live in the first place, was now forcing this issue. Was it a diplomatic lie by their government? If I went back, I would have to break my education, abandon all my friends and undertakings, just to fulfill his desires. I could not believe it. In other words, they were probably encouraged to charge me as a military escapee if I did not want to have anything to do with what was demanded of me, even subjecting me to imprisonment, or hefty sums of money to pay. Who knows, I could even be shot, as it used to be during the war years, thus fulfilling my father's original wish. This could have been in the plan. However, I could not completely believe him to be that wicked, and could not imagine being put together with extremely mediocre-minded soldiery to dull my mind completely for about 2 years. The Turkish authorities might have seen this fit when dealing with members of minority groups. My father had allegedly told the authorities that I could study and go to overseas countries after I had done my most important service to the country. If it was at all true, could he perhaps have meant it as being a service to him? The surprising issue here was that he was an adamant and utterly one-track-minded person who could not see anything ahead of him, just bent with his dreamt-of desires. This issue became like a black smoke one had to blow away. I had to write to both the German and Turkish authorities that I had completely divorced my father and was never going to return to Turkey. What about my original standing? Besides, why in the first place did he write in French to the French government to be accepted back, secretly asking me to post it all that time ago? What did he really mean with being accepted back? This is when I started my inquiries about migrating either to Canada or Australia. Since I was still studying and contemplating furthering my education after finalization of my courses, I decided to emigrate to one of those countries, convinced that it would be the end of the story. At one point I was invited to the Turkish General Consulate in Germany, just to be told that my parents, still living in Turkey, had not heard from me for a long time, and I should correspond with them. It was extremely unusual to be invited there just to be told to correspond with my parents. On the other hand, I was curious whether the Strohbachs had been blocking all correspondence with my parents due to their fear of possible influence from the devil, as they did before with things my mother had sent. Logically, I thought my mother or brother would have written to me direct on such a mundane issue. They might have, but if those letters had been confiscated by my Jehovah's Witness friends, that would have created the problem. Perhaps the Turkish officials were just checking on me if I was real and willing to go back to their country, or perhaps they just wanted to discover exactly where I was. That worried me a lot, and I felt as if I was hunted like an international criminal. I did not want to be bothered about anything else other than my studies, my part-time jobs, and romantic interests. I believe my mother was extremely pleased with my achievements, and if I married the girl I loved, she would be happy. I was not sure about my father and other relatives who never considered me as an intelligent individual, but I certainly had no need to prove to them who I was. However, there was yet another dark cloud over my head, and that was my mother's belief that Jehovah's Witnesses were taking her beloved son away. If my correspondence with her had not been hindered by the witnesses, she would have known the truth. I was certainly not owned by them. Before the Strohbachs left for Australia, they recommended that we, meaning me and Magda, follow them to the land down under. They were intending to settle in Tasmania. Before furthering my story, let me tell you some other intriguing memories recalled. While my romantic affair with Magda became more meaningful, I was very cautious and hoped that I was not being sucked into a situation one could not easily escape from. Soon my initial misgivings subsided, and I felt that I was definitely in love. But did she feel the same? Finally, there came a time when we spoke about marriage and having a honeymoon somewhere in the Swiss or Austrian Alps. Magda was quite excited about the prospect of having a family of her own, perhaps overly enthusiastic, while I envisaged remaining forever friends as a married couple into our ripe old age. I envisaged holding hands and walking the fields with her, even when we were 100, and enjoying each other's company as true friends in love. Probably it was nothing more than a pleasant dream on my part. Was I an idealist and did not realize it? I attempted to communicate with my mother about my desire to get married, hoping that she and my brother could see us in France or Germany, for I did not wish to visit Turkey for reasons I have already spoken of. Unfortunately, due to being considered a foreign dog, I preferred never to go near that country again. By some political miracle, if their attitude changed towards those they called infidels, considering them unworthy to be called humans, maybe then I could visit that country, rich with a colorful history and natural beauty. It is such a beautiful place, and anybody visiting it would almost certainly fall in love with it. Call it what you will, but I found it so intriguing that when we went for our adventurous honeymoon, after an extraordinarily unusual wedding, the place we planned to stay was fully booked, and other available accommodations were less than ideal. But we found a delightful small hotel. It was called Türkei, which in German translates into Turkey. I shall tell you more about it in a while. The idea of me getting married would please my mother, and seeing my relatives with my future spouse would even be more delightful. But perhaps that was never to eventuate. I never wanted to see my father ever again, and certainly never wanted to be forced into any possible conflict with him, and into conscription in a country which was not my home. Who could guess what the future had in store for us? But for now, there was no other choice for me to follow. If life had it in its plan, one day we could meet my parents somewhere in Europe, maybe in France. Alas, the Strohbachs had a very fixed idea about my mother being a witch, and considered any connection with her on my part as being a grievous mistake, an unforgivable sin. Since they were the servants of a gracious God Jehovah, as they claimed, they could never allow anything like fortune-telling, which my mother was allegedly engaged in by reading coffee grounds, into their sanctified lives. Whenever my mother sent me little gifts which would have cost her large sums of money, the Strohbachs burned them. I can never forget the specially handcrafted winter boots, which she sent without my knowledge, apparently taking a long while to burn completely, afterwards seemingly forming into figures akin to human bones and vertebrae. They were visibly very happy about their achievement, just as I have already mentioned in detail. Neither can I ever forget that hand-finished and very expensive rug. It was apparently woolen and took a very long time to burn, and this time they said it looked like a whole human skeleton after its destruction. As one can sense, my memories keep on repeating. I cannot forget how enthusiastically they told me all about their actions long afterwards, so that I could do nothing. Nor could I be tempted to rescue them. I was so certain that they have burned every single card or letter sent by my mother, whom they had never met or spoken to. They insisted that they did not want to have any influence of her black art, for it was evil and should always be avoided if we wanted to please Jehovah. In reality, was it just an insignificant publishing company they adhered to? I learned years later that this was something of a tradition among Jehovah's Witnesses. Shahan was apparently still writing to the Strohbachs, but I was told nothing other than that he has sent yet another letter, thanking them for looking after me. I strongly believe that he, or some other witnesses, having seen my mother reading coffee grounds and tea leaves, had been condemning her with witchcraft for a very long time. Indeed, as I have already spoken about, my mother was doing it just for the fun, although some of the things she predicted came true, but she was not doing anything evil. People loved listening to her, and as I said before, it was a traditional pastime. Understandably, there were certain things my mother could not tell people, but speaking of things as if seeing them in their cups often helped them. Black art, on the other hand, was never her interest, and she never wanted to see anybody get hurt, as was understood by forever judgmental folk. She preferred to help others whenever there was need, even if it meant giving away her last piece of bread so that others could survive. I was extremely saddened about this Jehovah's Witness fanaticism and superstition. I have never seen anything sent to me out of my mother's concern and love, but believe they could have been very useful. I felt, without prejudice, that what the Strohbachs have done due to their misguided and ungrounded condemnations and faith was the true evil, and not what my mother had sent me. I have therefore written to my mother telling her that those much appreciated gifts were damaged in the post, without saying what had really happened. Perhaps one needed to wait until we met one day. I hoped this diplomacy could help the situation. Being a very forgiving person, I considered it all as if not having existed, trying to forget. But the pain I was inflicted with by that cultist behavior was, and still is, unforgettable. Through their so-called unshakable faith, they declared that we should always imitate Christ-like qualities, one of which was never to judge others. What, then, should we call what they condemned my mother with, allegedly conducting devil worship without being so? In truth, my parents have never been religious. The closest observation would reveal them to be more down-to-earth atheists. It was their choice, and nobody had the right to judge them as wrongdoers. When I read what Mark Twain had written, I took his advice seriously. 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than the ones you did so. So, throw off the bowlines, sail away from the safe harbor, catch the trade winds in your sails, explore, dream, discover. I was certainly discovering things. Before I was introduced to Magdalene, I often visited the cities of Ulm, Frankfurt am Main, and Liechtenstein, sometimes with the Strohbachs. I found almost all European cities interesting, for they were rich in color and eventful history. Visiting those places had been like traveling back in time. Rothenburg ob der Tauber, for example, was like a fairyland, preserved wonderfully just as it was centuries ago. I still wonder why Siegfried wanted me to start a relationship with Sibyl there. Was it to make it truly memorable for us? Was this truly their desire to see Sibyl and me happy? Was it perhaps to camouflage a very serious situation between her and Siegfried, as I mentioned before? I might have been wrong thinking this way, but certain expressions observed painted an unfortunate image. I could only guess, but could not be absolutely sure. I was never to question what I observed, not making any remarks, only hoping that things would become clearer. I wondered what Ruth knew about this. Maybe she simply ignored it, or it did not worry her. When I spent some time in Paris during the holidays, I knew I was back home, while feeling somewhat saddened and even lost for brief moments in time, never wanting to leave. However, I was currently living in Germany, believing that there was some form of permanency, but things proved to be a little different. I cannot forget the times when I took long walks in the streets of this great city at night, visiting the Louvre, arcades, coffee shops, and listening to the street musicians. Some played their guitars, and others sang. I frequented wonderful spots and spoke to very friendly French. I certainly surprised a number of people with my caricature drawings. When visiting Normandy for a summer camping holiday, the weather was delightful, and Saint-Malo and Saint-Michel were divine. During this time, I was befriended with another girl, and spent a lovely time with her. Long after this meeting, we often wrote to each other in French. Interestingly, those letters were not confiscated. Such mini-holidays were important as they took one's mind off the normal, everyday concerns of life. Interestingly also, whenever one visited Paris, one always felt as if it was for the first time, because there were so many things to be discovered, always something else to enjoy. Paris still remains my real home. In fact, I could visit this city every weekend, whenever I wanted. Frequenting Switzerland and climbing the Alps was also one of my favorite holiday activities. My adventures often took place at Jungfrau, as I used to love mountain climbing and skiing. When I was introduced to Magda, and an interesting love affair started between us, I was unsure how things would develop. Would she also enjoy what I enjoyed doing? However, when we considered marriage, I felt a little apprehensive and unsure. My relationship with her was very unusual. but exciting nevertheless. In regard to Sibyl, her parents' abusive nature towards her was neither humanly desirable nor ethical. Here I am repeating myself for a specific reason. Remember, Sibyl's parents took the biblical texts, as interpreted by the witnesses, too seriously and fanatically, abusing her without realizing, believing that they were pleasing Jehovah. Her attempting to read women's magazines or looking into a television guide was also taken as permissible in their fanaticism. She was encouraged only to read Jehovah's Witness publications and concentrate only on the Lord's ways. One could understand how she must have felt. Unfortunately, I started seeing similar trends with Magda, but hoped she was a little more intelligent and able to control her fanaticism. With the supposed help of her parents, Sibyl's condition worsened, and as a result suffered from multiple personality complexes. In the end, she committed suicide. For the witnesses, it was just one of these things. However, a few of them might have sensed the strictly Bible-based control of her parents, who never considered medical science as important. I suppose they were praying to their God, Jehovah, to help her day and night, but nothing happened, and their faith eventually led to Sibyl's horrific end. If I would have started a relationship with her, much to Siegfried's delight, things would not be any better for her, and I would be sucked into a situation I never wanted to be in. I only hoped I have not been blamed for such a tragedy, for I did not contribute to it. These were memories I did not want to have, and yet they still haunt me, but at least without the hurt. I suppose time heals. However, when considering how things developed between Magda and me, I could not help but feel extremely worried about the possibility of blind adherence to the mind-dulling dictations of a fanatical group of people she adored, because I had seen the results of cultist extremism and what it actually did to people. On the other hand, whenever I think about how Samuel had been laughing at me, saying to his work colleagues, just as I remember, if he, meaning me, would have come here a few years ago, he'd really be useful within the underground bunkers amongst the low-grade trash, enslaved for the Luftwaffe, and building bombs for our Führer. It felt like the icing on the cake. Although I kept quiet for the sake of peace, I nevertheless got hurt. Before the Strohbachs left for Australia, and I had to organize different accommodation at Sister Nurk's, for a short while I felt somehow abandoned and alone. Long before my relationship was strongly developed with Magda, I met an English girl, Dorothy, in Stuttgart, who was studying in Munich and was soon to return to London. Spending time with her helped me to get to know a little more about the English. She was pretty and very bubbly, and invited me to go to London during the holidays. And I thought I could take the opportunity to do so before my studies continued in earnest. I decided to fly over to London, and because I had some savings from my earnings, I was sure I could accommodate myself as well as doing some shopping and discovering life there. I was advised that one could stay for up to 6 months as a tourist, but in fact, just a few weeks would be sufficient for my first visit. After having transferred my belongings to Sister Nurk's, I packed only what I needed for my immediate necessities, took my camera, and flew to London. When close to Heathrow, we did a round tour over the city before landing. I was extremely excited about this interlude. I was going to practice my English language skills, going to ride the double-decker buses and taste English cuisine, hopefully with the assistance of Dorothy. Although I had not made any prior booking, I believed it would not present a problem in finding accommodation, even if I did not meet her, but was soon to discover the contrary. She was somewhere else with her parents. On arrival, I asked the bus driver to drop me somewhere really famous and centrally located in London, which he did. I was in Trafalgar Square. At first I observed people going about their business, school children, walking in groups, and lots of cars. I spent some time in the restaurants and enjoyed hot drinks. Remember, this was my very first time in London. I walked long distances, roads which appeared to be unending, looked in shop windows, visited department stores, and finally arrived at Buckingham Palace. I admired the guards and stopped by one of the seats, gazing at this magnificent architecture. There were a number of school children within the confines of this marvel, and thought I could discover a little more about this palace. I asked one of the guards where I could find information about this exquisite edifice. I later learned that he was a guide and asked if I had a special invitation, so that he could admit me, and made a few phone calls on my behalf, and told me that if I wanted to meet other people, he could introduce me to them. One of them was his young son and family. I could apparently stay with them a little while, probably until the following day. That would be interesting, but when he told me he sensed something different about me, I began to feel worried. I wondered what I had got myself into. Then his friend, Detective Sergeant Steve, if my memory is correct, arrived, and I had a pleasant talk with everyone. I wondered whether this was the only experience I was to have, and then be turned back. That would be fine also. However, he received a call from within this magnificent building, told me excitedly that there was a young gentleman who would like to meet me, and was on his way. As I was here for the first time, I was surprised and wondered what made them show such an interest in me. After all, I was only a tourist. Was it by any chance a wrong identity? He said that I was a very lucky young man, as this kind of thing would normally not happen. I was unsure if I needed to believe in miracles, which my mother used to talk about. I became very curious about who that young person might be. Remember, I was only fascinated with this magnificent architecture, and nothing else. Soon after, an interesting-looking limo arrived, with a uniformed driver, and a young gentleman I was told about. My new friends and the young man exchanged a few words, but the guide and detective were extremely courteous towards him. I thought that he must be of a very important background, and conducted myself likewise. I was certainly discovering much about the English in such a short period of time. When he met me, he presented a face of great joy, but at the same time behaved extremely noble. I had a feeling about who he might be, but when he introduced himself, I wondered why it had to be me, a simple tourist and young person wanting to know a little more about this wonderful edifice. He said he would show me around, and was going to introduce me as one of his school friends to his family. This way, I would have a chance to learn about the building. I courteously thanked him for his invitation, and told him I was simply a commoner visiting London for the very first time. This is when he said he felt something very special about me, and asked if I could perhaps draw portraits of people, as this would be absolutely sufficient to have a reason to invite me in. I responded shyly that I was not a very special visitor, and hoped I was not being confused with somebody else. Do not be too concerned about it, and know that as we spoke you have been investigated. You see, we know that everything is fine to have you as our young guest artist. Indeed, even then I was very efficient at drawing portraits in charcoals and soft pencils, and could paint in oils, but this experience was totally unexpected. Maybe, I pondered, just maybe, young people were more privileged here, but I was unsure. The very first person he introduced me to was Ma'am. At first I did not recognize her, but was extremely courteous towards her. She greeted and accepted me as a friend of the young prince. As advised, I tried not to show any excitement in meeting her. I suppose I was lucky to experience an occasion like this, let alone during my very first visit to London. We walked and frequented big halls under several names, and a gallery of excellent portraits from antiquity. Then I was invited to share a small meal in the great royal dining area, where I met his older brother, who eagerly spoke about Australia and his lovely times there. They were keenly interested in botanic sciences, like their mother. Later, in a different area within the palace grounds, I had the pleasure of drawing this young prince's portrait. I was told that the likeness I had created was exceptional, and was asked to do the same with others within this magnificent place. To me, being truly appreciated and accepted was the most important aspect of my first trip to London. A beautiful accommodation organized in South Kensington was truly wonderful. I was going to stay there and virtually live in London for several days until my return to Germany. I was officially invited back to Buckingham Palace before returning to Kirchheim Tech. I thought I was dreaming about that magnificent introduction to London, but it was something one could never forget. My mother had given me certain papers in a large envelope, which I was encouraged to keep hidden from other people who needed not know everything. Alas, I had the curious trend to look at everything before hiding them from others. It was something passed on to me specifically from my great-grandparents, and contained important papers which would be completely useless in Turkey, but would have an impact in Liechtenstein and elsewhere in Europe, even perhaps in Great Britain. I was wondering if that young prince had any idea about it. I had a very positive feeling about my unique and perhaps even accidental adventure, but felt that I did not need to worry about it. I was simply to accept and enjoy what life presented to me at the time. After a period of time in London, discovering new trends which the Brits presented, I felt more at home, and eventually leaving it behind when I had to return to Germany was not very appealing. I was so extremely and quickly accustomed to life in Britain. It really felt as if I had come back home. However, I could start a correspondence course with one of the colleges or an academy, and whenever I decided to come back to London, I could sit for exams or continue with my higher education as a student. I was even offered very suitable accommodation in South Kensington if I returned. In fact, I contemplated that Great Britain could become my permanent or semi-permanent home. I was almost always ready for any trying exams and always prepared for any outcome. My greatest interest remained in medicine, particularly anatomy and also the arts. I was very passionate about what made a human into what a human was, what and who a human is. Perhaps then I could discover all about the living, growing old, and dying syndrome every one of us had to question. When I was invited to dinner in the great hall within the palace, where other dignitaries were assembled, everyone was having an exciting and wonderful time, especially when the mother, Her Majesty, made a brief appearance. This was completely unexpected. Personally, my food intake was no more than just tasting the cuisine so meticulously prepared by the royal cooks. In fact, food intake was not as important as being there and absorbing everything. Repeating myself, I knew I had come back home after spending a while in London. It was an experience I can never forget, whereas I could dismiss everything I knew of my past. Those weekends, when I took long walks along the streets of this wonderful city, they took me to so many interesting parts of the old and new town, from north to south, and to the East End. A trip into Kent and the rugged shorelines was so magnificent and exciting. I was very sure that I would return one day, even if for a short while, perhaps to study. As I said, it was very hard for me to return to Germany after what I had experienced, but there was study to continue. Still a few more things to discover, and my then lady friend to further my relationship with. Sister Nerg was apparently very anxious about whether I was going to come back, and was happy when I returned. I remember how she prepared one of her special herb soups on my arrival, and we had a long, hearty talk. She was keen to know all about my experiences in London. She mentioned how wrongly they were informed about the British during the war. The following week, I was to continue my employment with the Bosch Junkers, and could not wait to meet Magdalene. However, when we met, she was more excited about what she had been studying with the brothers, and not what I had experienced. I did not think that she knew about my special journey, and was probably unable to show her excitement about my presence. Perhaps she did not even notice that I was missing for a while, or possibly because we were not meeting as often yet. It seemed that it did not make any difference if I was away. In reality, it did not bother me. But my memories of the time I spent working as a transformer tester for AEG, remained alive for a while, where Magda's stepfather made hurtful comments about me. And I can never forget his sarcastic words. Once some Eastern European peasants were apparently given tasks to build small rockets they were using to bomb London. Obviously, they were enslaved in underground caverns, specially built for the purpose. It seemed incredible that one of the civilized nations of the world had been engaged in such a business of slavery. In short, I was happy not to associate with him at work. At the time of my visit to Great Britain, I hoped that I could apply for further studies at one of the universities. After several interviews, I discovered that I could sit for entry exams, and if successful, could further my studies in medicine, history, or psychology. My educational details and determinism seemed to have gained favor amongst the scholarly. Some declared that they were somewhat surprised about why young people like me chose to study in Germany. They may have felt uneasy about it due to their memories of the war. Others were not too pleased, considering that I had previously been wasting time in a country where my background was not regarded as worthy of any decent human existence. But none of this would present a problem if I chose to settle in Britain. However, I needed to go there on a student visa. This time I had traveled on a tourist one, which gave me a chance to get to know London and learn about the British before my return to Germany, although my stay on a tourist visa could be extended with the kind help of those wonderful friends in prominent positions. Unlike the stories told about how cold the Brits were, I discovered something totally different. I loved not only the city of London, but the somewhat extremely logical Brits who presented great potential to become permanent friends. If you like, call it one young heart's fantasy. This is also when I discovered a new interest there: science fiction. Some people advised me that I could earn money by drawing fine or science fantasy art for magazines if I wanted, while studying in London. That would be ideal. This way, by being employed on a part-time basis, I could support my needs and studies. On my return, however, I was happy with my simple accommodation at Sister Nurk's. Supporting her a little with some expenses was certainly very welcome, and I was going to do it gladly for as long as I stayed there. But I can never forget that smelly concrete containment outside her lounge. When it snowed and was very cold, she often put an old-fashioned metal hot water bottle in my bed shortly before my arrival home, after the drudgery of work. It was such a welcome idea in Germany's extremely cold winters. She had been living all alone before my arrival, and since her husband died, had no one to talk to. She was so happy telling me her own little stories, her joys and tragedies. Her husband had been a soldier some time ago, and they had shared a few sad and many joyful times together. She was very supportive of me, never wanting me to leave. When someone claimed anything wrong about me, she immediately showed genuine concern. She was not happy about the authorities willing to deport me to where I would be in great strife. She often emphasized that there had to be other ways to make my stay permanent in Germany. When she discovered my romantic interests with Magda, she was not only thrilled, but also talked to me excitedly, advising me to stand my ground, be the only leader because some others will try to take advantage of you," she said. I suppose I was embarking on an utopian journey. I later understood that I was dreaming of a perfect future, which was not to be. Magdalene, too, was likewise hoping for a fantastic future under the directive of the witnesses, who she adored above everything and everybody else. Remember, only the faithful would survive Armageddon to live forever, as it was apparently promised by the Lord in the Holy Scripts. The rest of humanity was to be wiped off, and evil would vanish from the face of the earth. During the following 1,000 years, under the lordship of Christ, all the Jehovah's Witnesses would build a new world order. After this period, Christ would release Satan the devil from the abyss to tempt the chosen of God, and those who passed those testing times would have everlasting life. However, all those who died before Armageddon would need to be physically resurrected, as it was also promised by God. According to them, their Bible is the Word of God, and it remains the only truth. This is why they all had to obey members of the Watchtower and Tract Society, which was based in Brooklyn, New York until recently. This is also where Bethel, the headquarters of their organization, is housed. Going back to my train of thought, I began to see Magdalene more often, almost on a daily basis, especially after she had spoken with her tutors, teaching her the ways of Jehovah, and they told her that it was all right to be befriended with me, as long as she avoided any sexual interest before marriage. Those tutors were never introduced to me, and I was kept totally in the dark. I was expected to be thankful for their decision to allow her to even have a friendship, let alone a little walk in the park with me. Years later I discovered that her every move was controlled, and all her major decisions needed to be approved by the witnesses. Admittedly, I was either too naive or fearful of losing her, and certainly did not care much about what the Jehovah's Witnesses would do. As I matured, I discovered the reality. I kept picking her up from the paper factory where she was employed, walking her home. As you can guess, we lived on more apples, bread, and a little wine when at her place. Imagine now two young lovers, he being eager talking about interesting subjects, astronomy and the beauty one could find everywhere if one looked for it, she being only eager to praise the good Lord at every opportunity. The warning signs were there, but I was only listening to the songs of heart. We often spoke about our backgrounds, education, and other interests, but she felt compelled to correct my ideas and worldly thoughts forever. I tried to ignore it, believing that the situation would eventually change as we got to know each other better. Alas, I was to discover that this trend was to continue throughout our association, even when married. As we walked together during that period of discovering each other's ways, we looked at lots of colorful flowers, from time to time even talking to them, as if they understood us. However, Magda showed an unusually extreme interest in talking to roses, trees, and pebbles on the ground, and this trend remained for a very long time. She may have been joking, but I was never sure. I cannot forget how, in the beginning, her parents considered me as if I was their savior. Yet there was always a minute amount of resentment on their part. which could be seen in their behavior. As I indicated earlier, they spoke to me at every opportunity that when Emilia was pregnant with Magda, she wanted to end it quickly by doing all sorts of things to miscarry. I always wondered why. I could not see any logic in this, and one did not become any wiser even after many years. Often I observed Emilia hysterically laughing out of the blue, perhaps influenced by wine, declaring that she was so happy that someone like me had come along, and hopefully would take her daughter away. I took it as a joke, and told her that they would always be welcome at our home if I married her. She used to respond saying that I should make sure I loved Magda faithfully. However, one of Emilia's behavioral traits was most peculiar, for she was often seen kneeling on the floor, picking up crumbs from the carpet, and promptly putting them in her mouth. Was it due to being influenced by wine? Magda's father hardly spoke, preferring to listen to German military marching bands. But when he did, it was often about his days serving with the Hitler Youth. Emilia, on the other hand, listened to a large repertoire of Hungarian gypsy music. Why particularly so much interest in that kind of music? Maybe due to her involvement in a gypsy love affair, which she spoke of, but which did not have ended ideally. One could not be certain about her supposed involvement with Magda's birth father. Magda had no idea about who her real father was. Alas, it could not be mentioned nor verified due to a variety of reasons. However, Emilia told me almost everything in her completely drunken state, and often begged me not to tell anything to Magda. I found it hard not to think about what she told me in regard to the awful things she did to get rid of her, but Magda, who was very stubborn, had survived. She felt forced to love her daughter, who now, an educated young girl, working in an office. Whenever Magda's parents talked to me about how sad they felt about her involvement with Jehovah's Witnesses, Emilia exclaimed she hoped that one day I would take her away from that cult, while hoping that she would also look after her mama. I used to respond to her with, "Yeah, by offering you more wine perhaps." She always reacted with smiles. During the weekends and upon our meeting at an earlier time, Magda, who always aimed to remain truthful in everything, lied to her parents, saying that we were going to a dance, a swimming, or a restaurant. But when outside, she immediately changed her tone, demanding that we go to Jehovah's Witness meetings at the local Kingdom Hall. She often told me things like, "If you love me, as you say you do, you must demonstrate it by going to these important meetings with me, because the end can happen any day now. It is written in the Bible, and it is the only truth." I was subjected to this advice whenever I met her, and, as she often added, we must think of our priorities first, and so later we can worry about the mundane. Often repeating what her witness brothers advised against any formal education, she attempted to lecture me about what I might consider learning. Obviously, she was in need to control my every move and thoughts as her dreams led her. Again I say the alarm bells kept ringing, but I was deaf and blind to her unique characteristics, for love's sake. We kept attending those meetings. However, I never stopped my education, even though I was forced to keep everything secret. Oh, how much I would have loved to go dancing with her and to other social occasions, concerts and cinemas from time to time. Those times sadly remain as memories of once upon a nightmare, when she repeatedly told her mother that we were going for a walk, always ending up doing something contrary to what I would like. She would go for her Bible studies with her brothers belonging to the local congregation, where I was never invited, and would simply sit in the park or go to a coffee lounge and wait until her arrival several hours later. Only then could we have a little walk and be romantically engaged. Even that was often spoiled with only thoughts being considered important by the witnesses. It was indeed her sole interest when she studied with those brothers, making me wonder why I was not allowed to meet them. Remember, Jehovah's Witnesses call their baptized members as brothers and sisters. Was Ruth perhaps teaching her the ways of witnesses before Magda's Bible study was passed on to a brother? I had no idea. It was a fascinating phenomenon, and I was always kept in the dark as to who the other people teaching her the supposed Bible truths were. It remained hidden. I tried to ignore how she lied to her parents, demanding that we go to the Kingdom Hall. I could not tell her much other than that I was only befriended with the witnesses because I needed friends, and certainly did not consider myself as a baptized member of this belief system. Whatever those brothers and sisters declared would always have a deeper impact, for allegedly they never spoke of things which were untrue. Therefore, whatever they said on behalf of me or behind me could only be the truth, as she often claimed. For love's sake, I could not do much, and that was one of the hardest things I had to endure. I was forced to hide many truths about myself, including my studies, for, after all, any kind of higher education was considered as being a tendency towards materialism, and therefore devil worship. In all honesty, I was enduring something extremely dull and boring just to please her, while hoping that perhaps there was something in their teachings which I might also benefit from, perhaps discovering something new and exciting. But what I realized was that everything read and interpreted remained just the same. They were presented over and over again as being newly discovered and previously unknown truths, utilizing new ways of describing the old, using a variety of words, for German language was rich in idioms and colorful expressions. When something was not fully understood, other great thinkers' ideas and words were repeated by a group of elders working at their headquarters. As could be found in their magazines and books, interestingly, they remained anonymous until many years later. Anybody inclined to conduct a serious study can easily discover much of the information made available within the rich literature housed in worldwide libraries and on the Internet. Some of the wisdom presented was based on common logic, or adapted from the works of other authors, without giving them any credit. I felt that although the authors whose knowledge had been stolen, considering them as worthless outsiders, the witnesses nevertheless regarded their wisdom as apparently being inspired of God. For obvious reasons, one could not say anything to the contrary, for the authors of Jehovah's Witness publications had to be the chosen of God, and therefore inspired to write only the truth. In their yearbooks, one could read all about the sufferings of their brothers and sisters, and their hundreds of hours of long pioneering activities all around the world. They were apparently suffering for preaching the truth, as commanded by the Lord Jesus. Personally, I could not say anything other than just play a role, pretending what I was not, for the sake of pleasing her. I was befriended with a number of other witnesses, who often promoted a strict moral code and spoke of honesty. However, after all the things observed, I felt the urge to question their integrity. Were they really so honest while displaying complete hypocrisy in their beliefs and behavior? My simple but important questions still remained unanswered. For example, how did sin enter the equation, and why did a great God invent or allow it to happen? When the good God commanded his important creation to become many on the face of the earth, did he also foresee that they were going to have incestuous relationships, and their offspring would become defective? No matter what I tried to explain, Magda always had to be right. I was fearful of losing her, blindly mesmerized by her charms. Remember, it was my very first serious love affair. I continued to live a life of pretense, and hoped for better things. Many years later, I was to discover that her love was only for her own needs, ends, and interests in that belief system the witnesses adhere to. She was completely sucked in, and nothing else mattered for her any longer. Although belonging to a strict Lutheran evangelistic church, her parents were totally against her being involved in any cultist movement. Even her Aunt Mitzi was anti-such activity, speaking to me discreetly. Magda displayed extreme naivety in many other ways, thus making one feel that she needed to be looked after without making it obvious. They were all hoping that I was going to be able to assist her to see things as they were in real-life circumstances, but unfortunately I was introduced to them as a believer in the truth, and this truth had to be the Jehovah's Witness truth. And according to Magda, my knowledge of the Bible was remarkable. If she would only listen to reason, she would be shocked to discover multitudes of discrepancies amongst the Bible writers. It was impossible to explain anything to completely closed-minded people, rejecting any alternative ways of thinking for fear of God's divine punishment of the sinners. I kept trying to explain a few important matters, but was never able to get through. Was I not a newcomer, still learning German, and being from a different background, allegedly unable to express myself properly? No matter what my lingual lack may have been, I was capable of expressing myself even if I needed to use dictionaries. Albert Einstein says, "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." That is the truth. I tried to convince her that I was not what she thought I was, but could not succeed. Therefore, I asked her several times point blank, if I was not a witness, would she still love me? Her hesitant answer was that she could, but she needed to get to know me a little better. However, if she was eventually baptized in their faith, she would only prefer to be involved with a baptized brother. There were several of them waiting for the opportunity to ask her hand in marriage when she was baptized and serving the Lord. I hoped I was not hindering her progression in that regard. I could not tell her anything else other than enjoy all those times we spent together, even if this affair came to an abrupt end. I was unsure whether I was doing the right thing by falling in love with her. I was not in a desperate hurry. I was still very young, just like her, needing to learn many more things about life. Although spending much of my time with her, most of which was taken by her religious education, I was unsure whether we were to start discovering about each other's characteristics, needs, and interests more thoroughly, other than what we had so far, in a most restrictive manner. Whenever I asked her if she loved me as I loved her, the only answer I could get was always a hesitant, "Love can grow." Another of her favorite sayings was, "Respect to one another is very important, and respect must be earned." When I spoke about it to Sister Nurg, she asked me if that rule applied to Magda as well. Besides, she said, "You are so young and just learning about the facts of life. There are many other girls you could fall in love with, and they could love you for what you are, not necessarily how they might try to recreate you to their liking so that they can love you." I did not completely understand her, but much later I discovered how right and wise she was. I was thinking about my other lady friend in London, but we were not close to each other. I knew I could fall in love with her without any fear of being forced into a mold, but I kept going with Magda, despite all those alarm bells. Perhaps her love for me was yet to grow. As time went by, my romantic dreams became a little more intense, yet I was constantly bombarded by her parents on one side and Jehovah's Witnesses on the other that premarital sex was a great sin for good Christians. However, sex is an expression of one's love without worrying about any pregnancy issues when using precautionary measures. Personally, I was not going to push her into something she was not interested in or comfortable with, making her realize that I respected her. I even told her so, and hoped that it made her feel happier and more at ease. Interestingly, Magda always felt the need to ask other witnesses permission and advice in regard to everything she did or thought of doing, particularly issues concerning the subject of romance, falling in love, lifestyles, and health. She was always told what to do and how best to live. In other words, she was becoming more and more dependent on advice given by the witnesses, no longer able to decide anything for herself. In this story, we discover the effects of the Jehovah's Witnesses belief system on their members, controlling their every move and every thought. This is said without being discriminatory. I knew that Magda was an unwanted child like me, but under completely different circumstances. maybe there was a reason for us to be together. Maybe we were going to learn something from it. Even then, I was unsure about the existence of a supreme being in charge of everything within a very big universe. Even then, I pondered about the nature of existence and the constant state of cause and effect, but I could not understand why there needed to be a deity planning my or anybody else's life. Although I could not accept purely accidental beginnings, I equally could not believe in a God who was ever ready to punish and destroy his or her creation either. The Bible is replete with such stories. Nevertheless, our unusual relationship continued to develop, and my parents, particularly my mother, whom I had not seen for such a long time, were overly excited by my telephone conversations, and in a sense I felt they were already congratulating me for my yet-to-be marriage. My studies were of utmost importance, and I was determined to continue with them. In fact, I surprised myself in that I could study and work at the same time, while also falling in love. Magda's mother continually kept repeating her words, whether drunk or sober. Take her away to somewhere distant. I always remember her holding a green or white wine bottle in her hands, as if hugging a newborn baby, whenever she was home. Imagine ringing the bell and a woman opening the door, almost always presenting herself with a bottle of wine in her hands, inviting you in, and you step inside with some trepidation. You would most certainly discover Emilia's love for wine immediately. Everything she cooked had to be saturated in wine also. While cooking, she felt the need to drink and listen to Hungarian gypsy songs. Although the food cooked had a beautiful aroma, we were only offered dry bread, apples, and wine to take with us to Magda's room. Her father was not happy, even perhaps frightened of me sitting at the same table when having dinner. He often deliberately spoke about it to Emilia and Magda. I could always hear them argue, even when standing in front of their door, but pretended as if I heard nothing. I often told Magda that hopefully I was not causing any inconvenience to her father. She used to tell me that nothing was of any concern, and I should not be worried, but if we went to her room, for a while her father would be calmed. This was one of the reasons why I preferred to meet her outside. As our romantic interludes became more intense, and I drifted into a dream where everything looked so bright and beautiful, I believed that she also loved me. I was yet to discover many years later whether her love was real, long-lasting, ephemeral, or non-existent. I was extraordinarily patient with everybody, and not hasty in being judgmental. I respected everyone out of my love for life and humanity. However, those who could not tolerate my presence due to their ungrounded rejection of foreigners, I preferred not to associate with any longer. As one can see, our romantic involvement remained sinless out of respect to her parents' demands, and those of her faithful brothers and sisters. Despite all this, Magda began to show signs of extreme jealousy, asking me over and over why I was looking at this or that girl, but it was not my interest. It was becoming very hard to explain to her that when I looked at others, it was not due to lustful desires. This showed me how insecure she felt, because she was listening to advice given about young men who looked at other girls, some of them unable to control their feelings for the opposite sex. She believed they were sinning by looking at others. Apparently this rule, too, was written in the scriptures. Sister Nurk was annoyed when she heard about it, asking me, "What about her? Does she not work with other men?" It seemed that we needed to talk about this allegedly vitally important issue as well. I always believed that if there was true love, there was no need for any jealousy, but more trust was needed. Obviously, we were learning about each other, and, as she repeatedly exclaimed, love can grow. One sincerely hoped that this kind of learning about each other was not going to be forever, since we had to grow our love for each other. I was probably wrong in thinking that love simply happened between two lovers. I was really worrying, for it seemed as if I was drifting into a situation which was going to be impossible to escape from. Was I perhaps asleep while dreaming of work and study? I was probably hoping to be loved just the way I loved. Was I just dreaming of that ideal also? In these modern days of our lives within the Western world, all of us work and study with the opposite gender, without the slightest desire for any relationship. Are we also sinning by living and working with them in a democratic society? It really did not make any sense. On the other hand, Magda always proudly declared that she had never been kissed in a romantic way until she met me, and certainly had never been touched by any man. That was very interesting indeed, for it was not completely true. She told me that one day she was terribly perturbed and crying. Without knowing the reason, I assumed it was probably that someone had died, but one of her relatives, I was not sure who, kissed her tenderly on her mouth, in a French way, as she classified it. I might have appeared very naive to her, as I made no comment. Then she promptly continued, saying that there was absolutely nothing wrong when something like that happened amongst one's relatives. Extremely surprised, I asked about how it would be classified if this was constantly experienced with one's close relatives, such as a father or an uncle. Her answer to that was, it presented no problem or any other concern because it was something that normally happened in one's family, that I should not be so fanatical about it. But I found it very hard to accept something like that as being normal. Did she really understand my accented speech? Did I miss something? Did I hear it wrongly? Did she tell me about one of her dreams, perhaps? However, I always kept a diary of my daily experiences. Did I need to make up a story to jot it down just to make her look unstable? I prefer only truthfulness in all things, although she might have thought otherwise. Did one need to become a Jehovah's Witness to understand things? Maybe my feeling disturbed about this subject was due to my upbringing. Maybe theirs was the right way, for, after all, according to biblical wisdom, God's great creation, Adam and Eve, have followed the divine command to become many, thus leading their offspring into incestuous relationship to populate the earth. Hopefully, this statement does not lead some of us into insidious sinning. According to the teachings Magda was subjected to, it would be an unforgivable sin to question the Spirit. Because of my love, I need to put this story on the back burner. Incredibly, it seemed that certain ways of kissing and touching among one's relations had no meaning, and I needed not be concerned about it, and love could grow. I found it to be extremely unusual, and certainly unacceptable within any civilized society. Maybe I had become a little too sensitive within my own little world, yet she was so extremely surprised that I had questioned her in regard to what she felt about being kissed by her close relatives like lovers did. I decided to keep quiet for a while, simply trying to ignore her naivety. There had been other men, some of them salespeople, and a number of them were middle-aged individuals who used to make rather sexually oriented remarks to her, but she did not grasp the meaning behind their comments. And if one spoke against that issue, she became extremely ill-pleased. On the other hand, I was expected to look at nobody, or make any remarks in any romantic sense. I never believed in showing signs of jealousy, for they were, in reality, signs of insecurity. She laughed hysterically, sharing little jokes with those salespeople, even though she did not know them. Was she fully awake? In all honesty, I could not interpret those empty gazes on her part. I believe that special look she presented might have been understood by others differently. Or was it a sign of the thinking part of her brain shutting down when something extraordinary triggered the condition? It remained a mystery. I was certainly not jealous, but her behavior was a concern. How best could one help Magda without making it obvious? By every passing day, our relationship became a little more serious, despite various discrepancies we endured. But somehow, the bittersweet experience of romantic and at times illusionary love blinded both of us, leading us into further dreams. We decided to prove the seriousness of our relationship by getting engaged in accordance with their traditions. Her parents hired an inn for the occasion, invited all their friends and relatives, and only a few witnesses, for many could not make it, as they all had more important things to do, such as attending Bible classes or pioneering, going house to house. Magda's relatives and family friends had organized the event, with typical Hungarian gypsy violins being played and vast quantities of alcohol, mainly wine, being consumed. None of my relatives were able to join, although I wished they were there. The guests raised their goblets, toasting, and some of them uttered a few drunken words. Magda and I stood in the middle of the dance floor, and when all were quiet, I formally asked for her hand in marriage in a very traditional way. We exchanged our thick gold satin-finished rings, declaring our endless love to each other. Every one was excited, and all appeared very happy. I even had to crush an empty wine glass under my right heel, as part of their tradition. Magda's mother was keen for me to go into another room, to tell me that she knew I was going to look after her daughter, advising me to do everything possible to break her off from Jehovists, as she called them, demanding me to promise. However, in her drunken state, she said that if I hurt her in any way, she would most certainly kill me, although she knew that I would love and care for her. Then she swallowed the rest of her wine, put the empty glass on its side on the table, and uttered a few short words like, "According to tradition," and placed her lips upon mine, putting her hands between my legs. This gave me a huge shock, and I could not get away quickly enough, while she uttered, "No words to Shamu, and no words to Magda, understood? I know you want to stay faithful to her only. Promise me." In all honesty, I never expected anything like this in my wildest dreams, and thought that she was most definitely drunk. In that instant her sister Mitzi came in, and Emilia shouted, "We were only talking." They were certainly following their traditions. When I got inside that room, I found Magda having a good time sitting on the knees of a mature gentleman, apparently her uncle, giggling under the influence of wine. She joined me as I went out for some fresh air, and we kissed as if having never kissed before, and forgot about everything and everybody else. Soon we were to start making arrangements for our wedding cake, possible photographs, her dress, and a little more. However, going to work the next day was the hardest thing to do. I decided to tell her nothing about Emilia's unusual behavior towards me, thinking she probably knew all about it anyway. Then again, she would probably think I was telling lies. But I had no reason to do that, and unfortunately I am still unable to forget it. Was not interested in an evangelical wedding ceremony, although her parents would not oppose it. I, on the other hand, never wanted to have any religious ceremonies, preferring only an officially recognized one in a registry office. However, Magdalena wanted to be recognized by Jehovah, therefore needing a congregational blessing for our marriage, leading to a holy service to God with complete dedication. Neither her parents nor I could convince her that a non-religious ceremony would be neutral and very nice one. We were going to have our once-in-a-lifetime event in the Kingdom Hall, as per her demands. Alas, it was completely opposite to what I wanted. I was not convinced about God's business in the strictest possible way. With the assistance of Magda and her close friends, bent with the subject of the end times, in a very indirect sense I had become completely anti-religion and any other form of cults, but they could not comprehend this. I was never able to speak to them, even make some sense about how I felt regarding mythological belief systems, but I needed to pretend as if being supportive. I could not tell them how I felt about everything they preached, nor could I explain the real truth about myself for fear of losing her. In fact, I was convinced that she would turn completely against me, as she later did, and it was going to hurt both of us. I still hoped that things would change, and she would be able to understand me, if her love, as she proudly declared, in the most restrictive way one could imagine, was true. That was doubtful. I believe that she loved the myth she chose more. She equated everything with trust of God, love of God, and servitude to God. She never considered the beauty of having a family, a partner, or a child, instead considering all those important elements as being only to serve Jehovah in the strictest possible way, and just preach the so-called good news to multitudes before the end of the world. By every opportunity, the witnesses try to encourage their adherers that God-loving people should not be married, for they could do so more successfully after the long-awaited end of all things. I had no choice but go along with what was available at the time. I was in a situation which I preferred never to be in. There were a few witnesses gathered, Magda's parents seated at the front. We were guided separately from the back of the hall to the platform, where the appointed minister performed the ceremony in the most Jehovah's Witness manner, and we repeated our vows, exchanged our rings, this time wearing them on the opposite fingers, taking them from the right hand and putting them on the left. I remember how I rushed to the platform, and that was interpreted as my eagerness, whereas in truth I wanted this part of the wedding ceremony to be over quickly, so that we could continue with the celebrations which were to follow. This was also the time when we discovered a self-contained dwelling above a chemist shop, which was close to the shops and city center. During both ceremonies, Emilia and her sister decided to film our wedding using my 8mm camera, which normally delivered reasonable quality imagery. The end result was an unfortunate jitter, an unreasonable movement of occasional images of those present, but mostly of the seats, chandeliers, and ceiling. One evening after our honeymoon, I showed the entire film to Magda's specially gathered relatives. They laughed, giggled, and wondered why there was no image of the ceremony or any images of us. I told them to question Mitzi and Emilia, for they were the camera operators, as they volunteered to do. "Well," said one, "I wanted to take pictures of everything without missing anything." Well, the other declared, "You see, a film is made up of moving pictures, and so I moved it into all directions, and the camera should have taken it all." I thanked them for their generous effort. Magda said that we could take other pictures of the wedding later, and it should not present any problem. Were we, by any chance, going to repeat the whole ceremony? I wondered. Did she also feel how I felt about the whole story? Taking pictures and recording sounds was not as important for Magda as serving the Lord. Years later, she recognized the importance of memories captured on film and sound recordings I made. Later still, she destroyed all her photographs as well as others, even those I provided her with. It seemed that she did not need any memories of her past, her childhood, her own children, instead replacing everything with Jehovah's Witness yearbooks, magazines, and records. But when all our memories are wiped off, what is left? We must never forget that memories make us what we are, no matter how humble or exciting, how happy or sad. No matter what we have experienced, studied, or been involved in, we need to memorize them, and having audiovisual reference materials is important to help us recall our memories and improve our thought patterns, express our inner feelings, our achievements, and even invent new ways of understanding. I believe some of the mental illnesses experienced amongst the elderly can be greatly improved if people could only utilize their memoirs whilst also becoming involved more in multifaceted interests. In short, a few months after our engagement, we got married with very limited photographs and no sound recordings. It felt like an omen, as if our marriage was going to become extinct, just the same as those films we had to consider as never being in existence. In reality, I was never superstitious about it, although our honeymoon was very peculiar. Just to please her, I did not take any photographs, for she was overly anxious and worried about my taking pictures, since there were more important things in life to worry about, and much Bible reading, much praying, and taking the good news to millions of people. The hotel we had booked into, being told over the phone, "Just come in," was not to be. We did not need to look for long for an alternative, as there was a beautiful and well-presented hotel, Turkey, to stay in. It was clean, and the food was exquisitely German. This is where, she said, she became a woman. That was an interesting and certainly very exciting statement. No doubt I was going to discover many more things. The hotel staff were extremely friendly, and we could stay there as long as we wanted. Originally, we planned to go to Switzerland, but were stopped at one of the stations for several hours, as near the Tyrol there had been shootings by extremist groups, and the police were investigating. When everything was clear, we went to Austria instead. It was so delightful there, discovering other aspects of Europe while visiting the Alps, villages, and lesser-known parts of Austria. I always felt that taking photographs of places one visited would make the whole effort and money spent valued. But in respect to Magda's very personal wishes, I refrained from sinning by taking pictures. To tell you the truth, all our activities were as good as non-existent. Yet amongst all the memories of the time, Hotel Turkey shines brightly. The name, as I said before, means Turkey, but interestingly, as the people working there declared, the place had absolutely nothing to do with Turks. Our wedding coincided with Magda's birthday month, but we dared not to celebrate any birthdays, as they were considered by this religious order as a pagan practice and strictly forbidden. In fact, it was 26th July, to be precise. Christmas and Easter were completely ignored. Jehovah's Witnesses only celebrate the memorial service, where they allegedly recognize Christ's sacrifice for humanity and believe that he was killed on the stake to have humanity's sins wiped off. This is also when a handful of the select group, only men, symbolize their adherence to the 144,000 belonging to the small flock, apparently just as Jesus called them in the Bible. They are the only ones who can share the body of Christ by taking the unleavened bread and drinking the wine symbolizing the spilled blood of Christ for our sins. There are also those who will serve with Christ as part of their theocratic government after Armageddon. Interestingly, those who belonged to that group allegedly were always inspired of God, and they all knew it deep inside. They could never resurrect into flesh, but remain as spirit. Ruth Strohbach's father also belonged to that group. After our eventful honeymoon, we were home as a married couple, and I could never forget the letter sent to Magda by German officialdom, warning her against marrying a man from Middle Eastern countries such as Turkey, for they were known to treat their wives as second-class humans, giving them no freedom to express themselves, advance in sciences and education, and were usually beaten by their partners, who were never punished. But did they know me, let alone assume me as being someone from those Muslim countries? I had never been a Muslim, and was not even a Turk. My sin was, obviously, having stayed in that country before my escape into Germany. However, I still believe that such letters from their government offices had some bearing and influence upon their citizens. Magda kept working at the Otto-Ficker paper factory, and I continued for a while working various shifts at a textile factory. Every time I think of this, I am reminded of the following snippets of memory. While working there on a part-time basis, I met a Turkish gentleman of mature age, who used to make his own soaps with materials available at the factory, offering them to his colleagues prior to having their showers before going home. One day, someone working on the same shift told his workmate, known to be always drunk, that it would be nice to have a son like me, which angered him uncontrollably. The other person shouted so loudly that everybody could hear, and said he would rather commit suicide than have a son like that shit. Soon afterwards, I was called by their office to be told that they would keep me there for a short while only, because I was newly married with a German girl, but that I should start looking for a different job. This was of no consequence to me. Finally, I went to Stuttgart, and through their Employment Services Department and the U.S. Military Authority, I found very suitable employment at Bad Cannstatt, near Stuttgart, with the American forces, as an audiovisual technician. When I think back about the letter Magda received warning her against marrying someone from Muslim countries, it was one of the ugliest insults to my person. Magda was never stirred by it, or so she appeared. When we contacted their office in regard to that letter, they were not interested in explaining anything, other than preaching to us that they could only warn their citizens in extremely special cases like this one. When questioned about what the nature of this special case was, they kept silent, and a while later a lady officer spoke to Magda discreetly, saying that they were concerned about how Muslim men treated their wives, as in Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan. When it was explained that I was an Armenian and from a Christian background, the answer they came up with was, "Well, they are all the same, are they not?" This attitude was the icing on the cake. I wondered whether it was wise to stay in such a backward country like this, because the Germany I loved was not there any more. I started to consider more strongly about immigration to another country, like Canada or Australia, just like the Strohbachs had done. Previously, the Strohbachs had put a lot of effort and time in assisting me to obtain political asylum in Germany, so that I could not be deported anywhere for very special reasons, and they had known a few interesting cases with other people entering into their country successfully, obtaining asylum. They themselves had a few difficult experiences when they made their way through the Berlin Wall into Western Germany. Many tried to escape from east to west, and died trying, before that wall came down. I was not worrying about this issue for a long while, believing that I had been successful with my application. However, My political asylum rights issues surfaced once again. They advised me that they had considered my situation further, and as a result, even if I was married with a German citizen, I could face deportation, while many others from Middle Eastern countries would have the right to stay in Germany indefinitely. My special state, they considered, could only mean being deported to Turkey, as they did not desire to continue to be pestered by the Turkish authorities. In other words, whether I was studying or married did not make any difference, let alone my French connection. I simply had to go back to Turkey after all that time, even if it meant I could be shot, for there had been a few such cases, which would make one shiver. When a lady officer declared I really should go back to where I came from and leave my wife in Germany, I felt cheated and threatened. I decided to approach the highest political authority, and as a result was told that the country was in need to heal from the last war, and I was one of the unfortunate, unwanted people, although there could be ways for me to stay there permanently. In fact, that made me feel like a criminal. They were going to let me stay a little longer if I desired to emigrate to another country, such as Australia.